In the 20th century, according to R.J. Rummel of the Center for National Security Law, communist governments were responsible for more than 262 million deaths of their own citizens. Joseph Stalin, leader of the Soviet Union, purposely caused a famine in which an estimated 7 million Ukrainians perished, and then killed another 61 million in the Soviet gulags. Mao Zedong is responsible for the deaths of over 20 million Chinese in the Great Leap between 1959 and 1961, and millions more in the Cultural Revolution that followed only 5 years later. After World War II, Hungary became a Soviet satellite, much to the distress of the Hungarian people. Thomas Kállay fled Hungary as a youth as the communists began dismantling what was once one of the oldest continuous free nations in Europe.
The fundamental and iron reality of Hungarian life from 1945 to 1989, 45 years, was that it was an occupied country and held in thrall by an occupation force, frequently several 100,000 Russians. As long as the Russians maintained their armies in Hungary and showed a willingness to use that army as they did in 1956, there would only be a communist government in Hungary. As when that prop was taken away, and only when that prop was taken away, did the government cease to exist. The communist government ceased to exist.
In 2003, Leslie Dutton interviewed the Hungarian Ambassador András Simonyi, who didn't flee Hungary but remained.
I was very young, but I was a child, but I still remember the Russian tanks rolling down the streets of Budapest. It was tough, and I remember my father, disappearing for a couple of days at a time. It was a scary situation.
By 1956, the Hungarian people had had enough of the communists and Soviet occupation. They rose up and declared their independence of Soviet rule. After just 6 days of freedom, the Russian tanks rumbled into Budapest and crushed the uprising with brutal efficiency.
The majority of Hungarian civilians weren't able to flee Hungary. Most of them hunkered down and began a subsistence life of sullen endurance and survival. But others who stayed became opportunists.
The great bulk of the Hungarian people stayed, as I've pointed out. But there were those who stayed who became part of the regime that was imposed on the Hungarian people by the Russians. The Hungarian secret police, as a political secret police, asserted a total control over the population. Now, there is a huge difference between the people who stayed because they did not want to leave their homes for various reasons and simply pulled, as it were, the cover over their heads and hoped that they would not be molested or bothered. There's a great difference between those sort of folks, which was, of course, the vast bulk of the population, and those who stayed to serve the regime.
In fact, András Simonyi remained and flourished. What was the difference if some of your family members fled and you did not? Did that mean that you basically assimilated into the Soviet system and became a part of it?
Life goes on. You live your life as you can.
But basically, you became a part of what was left under the Soviet domination.
I was hesitant.
Full disclosure asked the ambassador how the Communist Party turned itself into a free market democracy.
You're quite right. It's confusing. What the hell has the Communist Party to do with the breakup of communism? And, well, it so happened that there was a very strong progressive liberal part of this so-called communist setup. They were not communists. I never considered myself to be a communist. My father was a liberal.
We asked Mr. Kállay, who witnessed the Soviet oppression, to describe the effect that communism had on the Hungarian society.
When you look at Hungary, at the generation that came into being in the closing decades of the 19th century and the first decades of the 20th century, You look at the achievements of that generation, and in every field you find men and women of worldwide renown. After 1950, nothing. So what happened? Communism destroyed not just the social class or social classes, but it destroyed the creative energies of an entire people. It drove them underground, it brutalized them, it destroyed them to the point where they could not produce the same titanic figures that had just come onto the world stage before the advent of communism. And it will take generations for this nation to recover from this wasteland that these people brought upon the country.
How does that make you feel?
I grieve. I grieve for Hungary and the Hungarians who have suffered so terribly for so many decades.
Having seen the absolute devastation caused by communism, Mr. Kállay is concerned about the negative attitudes held by many American citizens.
There are many Americans who are forgetting that this country stood on the ramparts of the civilized world for half a century, defending that world against the Nazis, Japanese militarism, and then, of course, prominently against the Soviet Union and communism. This nation and its people stood on the ramparts for half a century and held those ramparts, sure of their values and very sure of their objective. There are Americans who are minimizing the extent and the profundity of that struggle, and who are minimizing the importance of America's victory. There are too many who say, well, it wasn't that bad, and who say there are things that are as bad or worse, and who then have a litany of problems about corporate greed, political infighting in Washington, D.C., crises in healthcare and social services, and the like. But these are the problems of life that will never go away, but which we must nevertheless work on. We cannot forget or trivialize the achievement of the American people between 1940 and 1990, and put in the place of remembering those achievements, fixating on the alleged defects of American society. We must remember the vitality and the commitment of the ordinary American who paid the taxes and who fought the wars between 1940 and 1990 and beyond in the cause of freedom. That is what America is all about.
You can watch this program in its entirety as a Full Disclosure subscriber, or you can purchase the DVD on our website. Full Disclosure will continue to bring you the news behind the news.